Three children huddled in the cold rain, their breaths puffing in the night air. Their father lay limp beside them, as if he'd already given up. A woman, drawn by the sound of quiet sobbing, bent down to help, and her hand landed on something she couldn't believe. Beneath his filthy hoodie, she saw a luxury watch, gleaming like a secret in the darkness. In that moment, it wasn't just a homeless man lying there. It was a lie that was unraveling, and a truth no one expected. Who was this man? Why was he pretending to be broken? And how did three terrified children come to call a stranger Mama? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But to understand this moment, we have to go back to where everything went wrong. To understand how that stormy night became the breaking point, we have to step into the life of Elias Kingston, a man the world admired but never truly knew. At 36, he was one of the most influential innovators in the country, the quiet billionaire behind Kingston Innovations. Yet for all his achievements, guilt lived in the center of his chest like a weight he could never set down. His wife, Alana, died giving birth to their triplets, leaving him with three boys who depended on him for everything, and who, no matter how much he gave them, still longed for the one thing he couldn't provide, a mother's touch. Every night he watched them whisper to each other about families they saw at school, and every night he felt the same fear, that he wasn't enough for them, that they needed someone he could never replace. While Elias carried the burden of giving his sons a life that felt complete, Ariel Brooks was just trying to survive her own. At 28, she worked double shifts, waitressing during the day and caring for seniors at night, pushing herself to the edge simply to keep her lights on. People admired how gentle she was with everyone she served, but few knew how hard she fought to keep her emotions buried. Years earlier, she had been told her premature twins hadn't survived. The grief had carved a permanent ache inside her, an ache she forced into silence because the world doesn't pause for broken hearts. Yet whenever she saw children, something inside her tightened, like her body remembered something her mind had tried to forget. And deep down, she often wondered why the loss never made sense, why she still felt connected to a future that supposedly vanished. The only person who seemed to understand both struggle and hope was Mama Evelyn, Elias's mother-in-law and the boys' grandmother. She carried the authority of a woman who had lived long enough to see how life circles back in ways people can't predict. She told Elias often that God had already chosen a woman meant for those boys, someone who would love them the way their mother would have. But whenever she said those words, her eyes softened with something unspoken, almost like she was protecting a truth too heavy for anyone else to carry. The boys adored her, yet even they sensed there were pieces of their family's story she wouldn't share. And every time Ariel crossed paths with them at the diner or at the community center, she felt something pull at her heart, something she couldn't explain, as if the boys were pieces of a puzzle she once held. And there was a reason Elias chose to hide his wealth, a decision that shocked anyone who knew him. He had learned quickly that people treated him differently when they saw his success. They became cautious, overly polite, or painfully insincere. But when he disguised himself as an average worker, or even a struggling father, strangers revealed who they truly were. He wanted his sons to learn the world through honesty, not through fear or privilege. And he hoped that by living simply, they might one day find someone who loved them without knowing the size of their inheritance. And on the other side of the city, Ariel continued her routine, unaware that every time she felt drawn to those boys, she wasn't imagining it. The connection was real. deeper than she had any reason to believe, tied to a truth she never knew was taken from her. And what she didn't know was that her life had been stolen from her. It made him wonder if fate was trying to tell him something, or if he was simply seeing hope where there was none. Still, every day he found himself waiting for her return without admitting it. Near the end of the third week, tension broke in a way none of them expected. A stranger walking past the corner glanced at the boys and muttered something harsh under his breath about children being used for sympathy. When the boys flinched, the man stepped closer, raising his voice and accusing Elias of being irresponsible. Before Elias could react, Ariel rushed in from behind, placing herself between the boys and the stranger, with a force that surprised even her. She told him sharply not to speak to them that way, her voice trembling with emotion she didn't fully understand. The boys clung to her legs, and the man walked away grumbling, but the moment had already carved itself into Elias's mind. He watched Ariel's protective instinct take over so naturally, so fiercely, that his heart stopped for a second. In that instant, he realized he wasn't just searching anymore. He might have already found her. Ariel stayed with the boys long after the confrontation ended, unable to shake the tightness forming in her chest. She knelt down to comfort the youngest one, gently brushing the dirt from his cheek. The moment her fingers touched his skin, something inside her shifted. Like a door she didn't know existed had opened for a split second. Her hands trembled as she wiped his face, trying to steady herself before the boys noticed. She whispered softly that he looked familiar, even though she couldn't explain why those words came out. And as he leaned into her palm, her heart reacted with a painful rush she wasn't prepared for. It wasn't simple empathy, it wasn't pity, it felt like recognition, the kind that forms deep inside the body long before the mind understands it. Elias watched her quietly, noticing how her breathing changed and how her eyes softened with a tenderness he had never seen before. That night, Ariel's mind kept replaying the moment her hand touched the child's cheek. The feeling was so intense, it pulled her backward into memories she had spent years avoiding. She remembered the hospital room, the cold brightness of the lights, the panic swelling in her chest as nurses rushed around her. She remembered begging the doctors to save her babies, gripping the sheets until her knuckles turned white. They told her both infants didn't survive. She remembered collapsing from grief so heavy she could barely breathe. But there was a part she never witnessed, something hidden from her. What she didn't know was that one of the babies had cried, a faint but unmistakable sound. A nurse lifted the child and carried him out of the room while she lay unconscious, unaware that her world had been altered by decisions she never agreed to and losses that weren't entirely true. She woke later believing both children were gone, believing the future she had imagined had vanished before she ever held it. Over time, people told her to move on, to accept what happened, to focus on rebuilding her life. She tried, but the ache never left. It lingered like a shadow beside her, growing heavier every time she saw children that reminded her of a possibility she would never know. And now, kneeling beside those 3 boys on the street, the ache surged in a way that felt almost unbearable, as if her body recognized something her memory couldn't. Elias could sense it too. He didn't understand why her presence calmed the boys instantly, or why they responded to her with a trust they rarely showed strangers. But deep down, he felt the tension between fate and truth tightening around all of them, preparing to reveal something none of them were ready for. A secret buried in a hospital file would soon resurface and destroy everything Elias thought he understood. For years, he believed he had been told the full truth about his wife's final moments, trusting the records that explained how the triplets came into his care. But documents can be altered, stories can be rewritten, lives can be rearranged without the people involved ever knowing. And as Ariel walked away from the street corner that evening, still shaken by emotions she couldn't explain, Elias felt the uneasy certainty that the past was closing in on him. He didn't know how Ariel fit into his life yet, or why the boys clung to her as if she were more than a kind stranger. But soon, very soon, he would learn that the woman he had been searching for wasn't just the answer to his son's longing, she was the missing truth to a life built on half-told stories.
After long days spent on the street corner, Elias returned to a home that stood in quiet contrast to the life he pretended to live. His mansion, usually spotless and echoing with order, felt heavier now, as though the walls had begun absorbing the secret he carried. The moment he stepped through the door, the triplets ran toward him with unmatched excitement, gripping his legs and pulling him down to their level. They asked the same question they asked every evening, wondering if today had been the day he found the woman they believed was meant to love them. It stung him every time he had to shake his head. He carried each boy in his arms for a moment, letting their warmth ease the cold of the streets from his bones, but no matter how tightly he held them, he couldn't silence the fear growing inside him that time was running out. Later that night, Mama Evelyn watched him quietly from the doorway, her eyes carrying both love and concern. She didn't need to ask where he had been, she already knew. She reminded him softly that truth had a way of rising to the surface no matter how deeply someone tried to bury it. Her voice held no judgment, only a warning that comforted and unsettled him at the same time. Elias respected her more than anyone, but he didn't know how to explain the complexity of what he was doing. He wasn't just searching for a mother for his sons, he was searching for a piece of himself he had lost the day his wife died. Yet the closer he felt to finding answers, the more he feared the consequences. He could sense that something about this journey was bigger than his intentions, and he wasn't sure how to prepare for what was coming. Inside the company he built from nothing, a far different story was unfolding. His board of directors watched him with increasing suspicion, noticing the unpredictability in his schedule and the exhaustion etched into his face. They whispered behind closed doors, convinced that he was becoming unstable, that grief and pressure had finally taken their toll. Some questioned whether he was still capable of leading, while others feared his decisions would put the company at risk. They met without him, debated steps to limit his influence, and drafted statements in case they needed to intervene publicly. Elias had spent years proving he was capable of carrying enormous responsibilities, but photographs of him sitting on street corners in ragged clothes began circulating privately among executives. They didn't understand what he was doing, and they certainly didn't understand why he would walk away from comfort each morning to immerse himself in the world's harshest realities. Rumors spread quickly, reaching investors, advisors, and even competitors who sensed weakness. People speculated about his mental health, about whether he had finally buckled under the weight of his wife's death, and about how long it would be before the company announced a leadership change. Elias ignored all of it, but the pressure around him tightened like a rope he could no longer untangle. At home, he tucked the boys into bed, listening to them whisper their hopes for a mother they had never known. At work, he navigated carefully, aware that every misstep could cost him more than his reputation, but none of them, neither his critics nor his supporters, knew the real truth he was hiding. It wasn't instability, it wasn't grief, it wasn't irresponsibility. The truth Elias was hiding was far more dangerous than a rumor, and it was closer to destroying his life than anyone realized. While Elias fought battles in silence, Ariel was living a reality that felt like a test she never signed up for. Her rent was already past due, the kind of overdue that made every knock on the door sent her heart racing. Her nephew, DeAndre, was one warning away from suspension after falling behind in school, And her sister Jordan was losing her grip on the world a little more each day, sinking deeper into a depression that made even small tasks feel impossible. Ariel carried it all, working long shifts, covering bills, attending meetings at school, reminding herself to smile when her body wanted to collapse. Her manager at the diner threatened to cut her hours for being late, even though she had run straight from her second job. Yet despite all of it, she still offered kindness to strangers without hesitating. It was the one part of her she refused to let the world take away. She didn't tell anyone how heavy life felt, how the weight pressed against her ribs every morning when she woke up. She simply worked, prayed her sister would have a good day, helped DeAndre with homework even when her eyes were too tired to focus, and tried to believe she would somehow catch up before everything fell apart. Every time she passed the corner where Elias and the boys sat, she felt a pull toward them she couldn't explain. She told herself it was empathy, nothing more, but deep down she knew it was something stronger. Something that made her heart tighten each time she saw their small shoulders shivering in the cold. Even when she could barely afford her own meals, she found herself reaching into her bag to share what little she had, almost as if her hands were acting on memory rather than choice. One night, after another long shift, she dropped her bag onto the couch and emptied it to organize her things for the next day. Receipts spilled out, loose change rolled across the floor, and then something slid out that made her freeze. It was a child's drawing, folded gently as if someone had placed it there with care. When she opened it, her heart stopped. The picture showed 3 boys holding the hands of a woman who looked unmistakably like her. The details were small but impossible to ignore. The curly hair, the shape of the dress, the smiling face they had drawn with bright crayon strokes. Tears filled her eyes before she could think, and she covered her mouth to quiet the sound of her breathing. She didn't understand why the drawing made her feel like she had lost something important without ever realizing it. She sat on the edge of her bed holding the drawing, unable to stop the tears that escaped one after another. She didn't remember ever putting it in her bag. She didn't remember the boys handing it to her or leaving it behind. And yet somehow, it had made its way into the one place she kept her most personal belongings. She traced the lines with her fingers, feeling an ache she hadn't felt since the day she buried the idea of motherhood deep inside herself. It felt too real, too intentional, almost as if the drawing wasn't meant to be found by chance. She knew it was just paper and crayon, but the emotion it stirred inside her refused to be ignored. She didn't remember putting it there. So how did it get inside her bag? While Elias believed the streets were simply a place to observe humanity, someone was observing him. A black SUV appeared repeatedly, parked just far enough away to avoid detection, but close enough to capture every moment Elias and the boys laughed, argued, and carried on as though the world belonged entirely to them. Elias noticed shadows in the corners of his vision, a fleeting glint of movement, a feeling that he wasn't as invisible as he thought. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Every interaction, every kind gesture, every step he took carried a new weight, a hidden danger he couldn't yet identify. The street that once felt like a stage for discovery was beginning to feel like a trap, and he had no idea who had set it. Ariel, too, began sensing something she couldn't explain. Walking home after a long shift at the diner, she felt eyes on her back, shadows slipping through alleyways behind her. At first, she tried to ignore it, chalking it up to her imagination after so many exhausting days, but the unease refused to fade. Something about the way she was being followed made her quicken her pace, her heartbeat echoing in her chest as if warning her that she wasn't alone. And then, unseen by anyone but her, a woman in a mask crouched down with a camera, snapping pictures of the triplets as they played. Each shutter click was a small threat, a silent promise that their lives were about to become far more complicated than any of them had imagined. Meanwhile, Mama Evelyn carried her own secrets in the quiet of her home, moving with the calm precision of someone who had lived long enough to know when danger was near. She picked up her phone and dialed a number, speaking in measured, urgent tones. He's getting closer to the truth. We need to prepare." Her voice betrayed neither fear nor hesitation, only a certainty that the moment had arrived that she had long anticipated. What she was protecting, and from whom, remained unspoken, yet the weight behind her words carried a warning that stretched beyond anything Elias or Ariel could sense at that time. She understood the stakes better than anyone, knew the risks that came with truths long buried, and recognized the collision of past and present was approaching faster than anyone could stop it. And as she hung up the phone, the shadows outside deepened, quietly waiting for the right moment to act. The feeling of being watched, of being pursued, began to ripple through both Elias and Ariel, each unaware of how their paths were converging under scrutiny. The boys, oblivious to the danger, laughed and played, carrying the innocence that made them so precious and, simultaneously, so vulnerable. Elias's focus wavered for the first time in weeks, the careful disguise and constant observation suddenly feeling like a fragile shield against forces he could not yet name. Ariel's protective instinct sharpened, her every glance over her shoulder carrying the weight of unspoken questions and creeping fear. And somewhere, between the corner where Elias sat and the path Ariel walked, secrets and threats intertwined, moving quietly, like smoke before a fire. But what exactly was Mama Evelyn protecting? And who was she protecting them from? That question, heavy and unanswered, hung in the air, setting the stage for revelations that would change everything. The afternoon felt ordinary until it wasn't. One of the triplets darted into the street, chasing a loose ball that rolled farther than he realized. A car appeared in an instant, tires screeching against the asphalt,
And the world slowed for everyone who witnessed it. Ariel reacted before she even thought, diving forward and scooping the child into her arms just as the vehicle passed, narrowly missing them both. Her heart pounded, adrenaline flooding every nerve, and she clutched the boy to her chest, whispering frantic reassurances. From across the street, Elias's carefully constructed disguise shattered. He ran toward them, dropping the facade he had worn for weeks. He grabbed Ariel and the boy, screaming the child's name with raw, unfiltered emotion. The mask of the wealthy, composed father vanished in that instant, leaving only the man whose heart had been breaking silently for years. Ariel froze, stunned by the intensity of his reaction. She looked up at him, disbelief written across her face. "You said you weren't their father," she whispered, her voice barely audible over her own racing heartbeat. Elias paused, guilt and fear colliding in his eyes, and for the first time, the boy saw him not as a stranger, not as a man testing the world, but as the person who loved them more than anyone else could. The truth hung between them, fragile and explosive at the same time. Every secret, every lie, every careful disguise suddenly threatened to unravel in a single moment. And just as she processed what had happened, a realization began to sink into her bones, chilling and undeniable. She had no idea that the life she had saved with her own hands, the boy she clutched as if holding him close could protect him from everything, was actually her own child. If you're still here watching, drop a comment saying, "I'm still here." Let's see who's really following this story. The world around them blurred as Ariel tried to comprehend the impossible. Her chest tightened, memory she had locked away for years pressing forward all at once. The boy's small arms clinging to hers, the same trembling hands she had once held in a hospital so long ago, and the subtle familiarity in his eyes, it was all too much to ignore. Elias, realizing the magnitude of the moment, held both of them close, his own tears threatening to fall freely for the first time in weeks. The triplets clung to each other, unaware of the full weight of the revelation, but feeling the emotional quake between the adults who had protected them. And in that frozen, electric second, the story pivoted, shifting everything the characters thought they knew. Secrets would no longer be secrets, lies would no longer shield them, and the fragile threads of fate began to tighten around all of their lives. After the chaos of the street, Ariel couldn't bear to return to the corner. Every time she thought of the boys, her chest tightened with a mixture of longing and betrayal. She had acted out of instinct, out of a heart that never asked for recognition, only connection. And yet the truth she glimpsed in Elias's eyes left her confused, afraid to trust what she couldn't fully understand.
She stopped visiting, withdrew into her routine, and tried to focus on her sister, her nephew, and the endless responsibilities that seemed to swallow her whole. But the boys' faces haunted her dreams. She would wake to hear echoes of their tiny voices whispering, crying for her attention, their innocence demanding care she wasn't sure she had the right to give. Every night she wrestled with the ache of absence, wondering if stepping back had been the right choice, or if she was abandoning something far greater than she realized. Elias, on the other hand, felt the weight of his choices pressing down in ways he hadn't expected. Alone with Mama Evelyn, he admitted the truth he rarely spoke aloud. "She could be the one, but she'll never trust me now," he confessed, his voice heavy with a mixture of frustration and heartbreak. He had hoped the undercover experiment would lead to clarity, to connection, to love, but instead it had created a chasm between them. Mama Evelyn listened quietly, her wisdom holding space for his despair, reminding him that trust could be rebuilt, but only if patience and truth guided every step. Even as he absorbed her words, Elias couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that time was slipping away, that the fragile hope of family he had been pursuing so desperately might be forever out of reach, and that the secrets he had carried could undo everything before it had a chance to heal. Then, without warning, a mysterious envelope arrived at Ariel's door. It was unmarked, delivered anonymously, heavy enough to suggest importance, but light enough to slip under the radar. Trembling, she opened it to find a hospital envelope, yellowed at the edges, carrying documents she never expected to see. Her eyes widened as she unfolded the papers. There it was, a birth certificate with her name printed clearly, confirming what she had spent years trying to forget. And alongside it, a shocking revelation, a record of a baby she had been told was lost. Her hands shook, her mind racing as the impossible truth began to settle in her chest. She stared at the page, trying to breathe, to process the implications. And then, slowly, she noticed something strange. The birth date on the certificate matched the triplets exactly, as if fate had intertwined her past and present in ways she could never have anticipated. Ariel felt her world shift as she stormed into the hospital, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. She demanded answers, explanations, anything that could make sense of the impossible revelation that one of her babies had survived. But the hospital had no record of the birth she remembered. Files were missing, nurse rosters altered, and the footage of the nursery had been deleted years ago. Every question she asked bounced back as silence or excuses, leaving her more confused and heartbroken than before. It felt as if the truth had been buried intentionally, as if someone had decided long ago that her children belonged to a different story, a story she had no part in. Panic swirled in her chest, the ache of loss mingling with rage, and yet somewhere deep inside, a small spark of hope whispered that the answers were out there, if she could only find them. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Mama Evelyn held knowledge she had long kept secret, a truth too heavy for anyone else to bear. She had known all along that Ariel was the real biological mother of the triplets. The doctor who had delivered Ariel's children worked under the Kingston Foundation family, bound by loyalty and secrecy. One of the babies survived, hidden from Ariel for reasons she could barely imagine. Elias had never known, and in his innocence and desperation, he had devoted himself entirely to raising the children he believed fate had entrusted to him. Mama Evelyn had carried the weight of that truth silently, guiding events from the shadows, hoping to protect both mother and children while keeping the fragile balance of lives intertwined. Every decision she made now would determine whether the past could be reconciled with the present, or whether it would shatter everything they thought they knew. The revelation hit Ariel like a tidal wave, sweeping away years of grief and confusion. Suddenly everything, the strange pull she had felt toward the boys, the drawing mysteriously left in her bag, the unexplainable connection she couldn't name, made sense. And yet as her mind tried to catch up with her heart, a new question emerged, more complicated and terrifying than any before. If Ariel was the real mother, how did Elias end up raising triplets that weren't entirely hers? The threads of truth and deception tangled into a knot she didn't know how to unravel. Every revelation opened a new wound, Every answer led to more questions, and the weight of decisions made years ago pressed down harder than ever. The stage was set for confrontation, for understanding, and for the kind of reckoning that would change all of their lives forever.
The air between Ariel and Elias was heavy with every secret, every lie, every truth that had been hidden for far too long. She confronted him, her voice trembling, eyes burning with a mix of pain and disbelief. Elias could no longer maintain the mask he had worn for weeks, for months, for years. Tears streamed freely down his face as he admitted the truth, every confession spilling from him with the force of long-suppressed grief. The triplets, sensing the emotional storm around them, ran toward Ariel with unsteady steps, their small voices breaking the silence. "Mommy," they whispered, the single word carrying a lifetime of longing and hope. Ariel's arms wrapped around them instinctively, her body shaking violently as the magnitude of the reunion crashed over her. The years of loss, the nights of dreaming, the moments of unexplainable connection, all converged in that single, overwhelming embrace. Mama Evelyn stepped forward, her hands trembling, eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and